Hey guys, George Mesa, Third Eye Edify podcast. Today's episode found inspiration in a direction I did not expect. I had recently revisited Plato's Timaeus, which is sort of like a spiritual sequel and or continuation of Plato's Republic. It's specifically written as a continuation, as a matter of fact. If you read Plato's Republic and didn't know, you got to get right on this. I have this other copy called Plato's Cosmology, which is actually way bigger, but it has, as it says on the cover, a running commentary. Just constant comments about every little tiny sentence. In Timaeus, because it's not nearly as long as the Republic. And it's a very different book. It's a very, very different. It's written the same way, but it covers a lot of different stuff, and I highly suggest it's a quick read. It's quite short, as a matter of fact. Not quite as quick as my new book, World War U, but it's quick enough, and I would definitely check it out for many reasons. I approached that book for this to refresh my memory on some of the cosmology that was talked about in it, because I got a pretty big episode coming up with some pretty big names that I think you're all relatively familiar with. So I also want to shout out to Slick Dissident before we start here, because when I found this information and made this connection here that you're about to show you, I immediately messaged him and said, do you know anything about this? Have you ever heard anything about this? And we had a little back and forth. Shout out to you. If you want to follow up with another one on this, I'm all in. But here's what I've got so far. And here's what this whole episode is about. In the Timaeus, the Strait of Gibraltar, bottom of Europe, top of Africa, the entrance to the Mediterranean Sea, is named the Pillars. And another phrase that came out of this is the Pillars of Hercules that lead, to the sea. I have it specifically written, hold on. Beyond the Pillars of Hercules, as in Atlantis is beyond the Pillars of Hercules. This, in this context, would mean you exit the Mediterranean beyond the Pillars, and then you find Atlantis. And that got me thinking, because Solomon's Temple, Masonic Temples, they all have the two pillars, Yakin and Boaz. And I flashed the picture of the high priestess many times, and I will again later to reinforce something, because there's a lot of, let's just put a broad term on it and call it magic, involved with passing through the two pillars to enter something. And I'm starting to think that this temple, particularly now the Masonic Temple, because Solomon's Temple has yet to be proven as having even existed, as we will soon see. Much like dimensions are very accurate for buildings and of that nature in something like a Tolkien novel, same thing exists here. The Hebrew Bible has depictions of how Solomon's Temple is supposed to be built, how it's measured, cubits, as they often mention, which is supposed to be the forearm to the end of your middle finger, somewhere in the 20 inches range, I guess. Maybe a little more, maybe a little less. But what goes on at this temple? What is it supposed to look like? Have Masonic temples used Solomon's Temple? Clearly they have. As a template, is the orientation the same? Does the orientation matter? If those are the two pillars and you enter the Strait of Gibraltar into the Mediterranean, what direction is what, and how does it relate? What is at the back of Solomon's Temple? What is at the back of the Mediterranean? Or the far eastern end as we see it on our maps? Let's take a look. And please, like, subscribe, leave comments. I need to know what you guys think about what I'm going to be discussing here today, because this all just came out of nowhere. And I have a feeling I'm going to be pursuing it for sure. My voice sounds a little hoarse. No idea why. It could be because it's late at night, but I don't know. Let's keep going here and see what happens. So Solomon's temple is known as the first temple. And I'm going to pronounce this wrong for sure, but it comes up as Bet Hamikdash Harrison. Looks like Harrison. First word being Bet, B-E-T, which reminds me of Beth, second letter, the Hebrew alphabet, but as I described in episode 6, spelling bee, and according to Alvin Boyd Kuhn, esoteric structure of the alphabet, B is actually the first letter. A is 0, or a negation. Think of atonal music as music that lacks tonality. So that goes a long way to prove that, having been now being the first word of what is called the first temple. Very interesting, and just the tip of the iceberg here. So this biblical account of this temple is a temple in Jerusalem, which, capital of Israel, let's not get into that whole discussion right now. It's all discussed as fact, everything we're talking about here. This Solomon's temple. No remains are found, of course. Significant debate over the date of construction, over the identity of the builder, and believe it or not, having said that it may have existed between 10th and 6th century BCE, it has not been criticized until the 1980s. That came as a surprise to me, and I hope that it's a surprise for some of you as well. No one debated this. It's real. It has to be real. Very surprising to me. Not until the 80s. That could be a whole episode. I'm not going to get into that right now. So, the second temple was destroyed by Achaemenid Empire. Now, this is the same as the first Persian Empire, also known as Iran. So, this was founded in 550 BC. Maybe this has some indications on Iran's current status, sort of untouchable. Don't talk about them, nuclear power, whatever you want to call it. And Plato supposedly modeled his allegorical Atlantis on this exact empire, the Achaemenid Empire. History is crazier than fiction, as always. And which is real here? When was Plato? We're expected to believe that he existed, but has he not been criticized until the 80s? I don't know. That's a whole nother conversation. Again, I'm getting to some very different points today. And let's just take a quick look at the word Jerusalem, since that's where this takes place. Salem. I can't think of anything but witch trials when I see the word Salem. And maybe cigarettes. And when I did smoke, I didn't smoke those. So, another word to look at is Israel. Is-Ra-El. Isis, Egyptian goddess. Ra, sun god, Egypt. El, a common word for deity. And it's also quite commonly used for our own language in our own little mysterious magical ways that we have our language being shown to us. Electorate, electricity, and so on. So EL being a very, very powerful prefix for words that it didn't seem like it was a prefix for to begin with. Let's look at King Solomon. Solomon, soul of man, solo man, and not a huge Star Wars buff or anything. Certainly seen plenty of it, but Han Solo, solo man. What about Solomon's other name? Jedidiah, not Jebediah, but Jedidiah with 2 D's. First 4 letters being Jedi. That's pretty nuts. Didn't see that one coming, and I thought I would throw it at you to just get a little feedback on that, because that is interesting to me. That is very interesting to me. So, another thing to mention before we dive into some other stuff here is Solomon's father This is King Solomon here. Solomon's father is King David, the same David from David and Goliath. There may be another relationship to make here. I didn't make that, but let's see if anyone else out there comes up with anything, because I'm interested to know. Again, this is a kind of a feeler episode, trying to see where this goes exactly, because I'm seeing and coming up with an idea that I haven't really seen yet. I think it has merit. I think it has some very genuine merit. This is the house of David that his father had. Perhaps a chapel of David even. Dave Chappelle comes to mind here. Certainly a prominent figure on the world stage lately. Now, let's have a good look at what Solomon's Temple is supposed to look like. I have some fairly crude looking blueprints / diagrams on purpose. I need this to be uncluttered and clear for everyone to take a look at, for me to prove my point, or at least make my observation, right? Here is what Solomon's Temple is supposed to look like. And we have on the outside something called the Brazen Sea, something that is also known as the Molten Sea. Perhaps we can discuss what that might mean in a little bit. It's a large basin for priests to dip themselves in. So what goes on the bottom here, this is the overhead. You enter, you pass through the 2 pillars, you enter, you make your way straight to the back, and you find the Holy of Holies. This is how it's named. Similar thing, same idea. There's the Sea of Bronze in this case, it's called. Also, again, known as the Molten Sea. Now we pass through the pillars, and we make our way to the Holy of Holies. So it's the same exact idea. Get to the back, and that's where the Holy of Holies is. Other things involved in this that aren't showing necessarily in these are the Ark of the Covenant. Things we've all heard of before. Now, here's an image of the Molten Sea that I think may easily find its way into this conversation. Masonic floor tiles. No question about that whatsoever, I'd say. And it almost seems to be held up by a bunch of cattle. Keep this in mind, because there seems to be a historical debate now that Plato was actually discussing the island of Crete when he was discussing Atlantis. And on the island of Crete, there were the Minoans, who were some pretty magnificent seafaring people. And there was a lot of mystery over how they just simply disappeared, having been so powerful on the island of Crete. Now they're finding, and it's very recent, that there was a volcanic eruption that may have completely eradicated them, an extinction level event, if you will. And they're saying that they found cattle bones strewn about the shorelines. And molten lava reminds me of a volcano. And it doesn't seem like a coincidence here that we have this molten sea outside of Solomon's Temple, right? Think about it again. If the Strait of Gibraltar, I'll use the other one. If the Strait of Gibraltar are these pillars, then outside of that, we get the Sea of Bronze. Again, it's just no coincidence. I was going to show another map that I failed to place into this set of pictures here, where somebody had made an image of Atlantis, but Africa was on the left side of it, and America was on the right side of it. In other words, south was up, changing of orientation. This happens in more ways than one. And I hope to make a very strong point for what I'm trying to get across here in just a moment. Because there's always more to the story. An inversion plays in, but maybe it's not an inversion this time. Maybe it's far more direct. Normally, with the two pillars of Solomon's Temple, Joachim is seen on the south, Boaz is seen on the north. If we look at the high priestess, we can see there it is again, B and J, Boaz and Joachim. Now she's holding the Torah. I imagine this can be put in the same, it's not the same thing. It's similar enough to be called the Hebrew Bible. Let's just say it's something from Israel. Let's just say it's something from that part of the world. Now, if we look at a Masonic temple, and if you see this preparation room kind of sits where the Molten Sea is, so that's sort of a connection to be made there. No big deal, I don't think. But have a look at the orientation here. What looks like a Z is an N for north. If you picture the two pillars at the bottom here at the entrance, then the left pillar would be north, the right pillar would be south. Picture the Mediterranean Sea in this orientation. Spain is to the left. That's the left pillar facing, or the left pillar which would be north of the entrance. Africa, what would be Morocco in this spot? That would be to the south. And then you enter into the Mediterranean Sea. The Mediterranean Sea being this temple. Solomon's Temple, sure. Masonic Temple, I'm going with almost definitely. Are Masonic temples all representative of the Mediterranean Sea? Is this the kind of power that is trying to manipulate? What is at the back in this scenario? What is at the top? Pass through the pillars of Hercules. Go all the way up the Mediterranean Sea. What is at the back? It's Israel. The Holy Land. The Holy of Holies. Or in the case of this, the worshipful master. Is this totally far-fetched? I really don't think so. Considering the importance of this area of the world for more reasons than one, I would say there's a very fair bet. Now, there's been a lot of talk lately, and all very valid with tons of proof. It's not just conjecture, it's proof that the Americas, particularly North America, really could be housing some of the most ancient things. And that this whole trek here, the white man trekking to North America, really could just be another story on top of a story on top of a story of much, much, much more ancient travelings. However, based on our current history, based on our current world tensions, a lot of it takes place there, the end of the Mediterranean, the opposite end of the pillars, in the holiest of holies. And that is Asia, by the way. It's hard to imagine, but that is actually West Asia. Maybe not necessarily according to the UN, but overall, I'm not sure if the UN's opinion matters about much. It's a big place, it's a big deal. And Israel, as it stands, can go from the Mediterranean to the Dead Sea. It is a bypass, and I'm sure that its significance and the reason that it's been attempted to be overtaken so many times has something to do with that, possibly. It's a geographic reason. a strategic reason. Could be that more than a lot of other things, but there's too much debate there, and I'm not here to debate any of that. I'm here to say that these temples are actually representing the Mediterranean Sea. And there's been so much new, old ideas coming out lately from this field that it just seems very legitimate to me that it could be very true. Now, the Holiest of Holies has been sort of like a pseudo-jokey nickname for a part of the female anatomy. And based on the very, very, very small entrance of the Strait of Gibraltar, geographically speaking, relatively speaking, a very small entrance to the Mediterranean is all you get. It's also possible that they saw this as a vagina. It's possible, with the very back being where the promised land is. I don't know. I don't know how they saw it when all of these temple ideas were coming out. But if you walk through the Strait of Gibraltar, north is now to your left. And in Masonic temples, when you walk straight in, north is to your left. It makes perfect sense for the Mediterranean. Not trying to convince myself of anything, but this is what I see. And last but not least, if you're following a star to the east, as in the story of Jesus, I imagine if you were in the Mediterranean, you could follow a star to the east, and boom, there you go. You find the holiest of holies. So I think that's where I'm going to leave it for now. Please let me know what you think in the comments about this idea. I'm finding it to be pretty solid. There's far more to discuss, but let's see where it takes us. And you just never know where you're going to be taken at Third Eye Edify here. And I hope that you've come to rely on that as a matter of fact. I've got plenty more where that came from. I have some unbelievable interviews coming up. Several of them are going to be happening in quick succession, as a matter of fact. So prepare for that. Please find me on Patreon. Find me on Rockfin. Anyone supporting me at these places, thank you so much. It means the world to me. I'll make sure to put as much content out as I possibly can. And I'll make sure the exclusives are provocative enough to be worth it. I've got some new stuff at the merch shop. And I'm thinking of doing a discount price for the patrons. That way there's even more of a benefit to, being part of it there. So, like I said, plenty more where that came from. I'm going to have some news articles from some very interesting people very soon. And I look forward to all of it. Thank you again. And I hope to see you next time.